Well, we're 2 weeks on from the budget, and what's everyone talking about? Not the budget, I suspect. The political conversation has been dominated by all sorts of other things, but what's actually pressing voters' buttons? What are they talking about? What are they focused on? And what are their views at the moment on the two major parties? I'm David Speers, coming to you from Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Now, there were a whole bunch of opinion polls immediately after the budget. One of the most comprehensive is actually a larger piece of research that's done by the Redbridge Group and Accent Research. Tony Barry is a former Liberal strategist and Samaras is a former Labor strategist, both now with Redbridge. Very pleased to welcome you both back to the podcast.
Thanks, David.
Now, we caught up back in February, I think it was, last time down in Dunkley, just before the by-election. Now, here we are at the end of May. Cos, give us a bit of a snapshot first of how things look at the national level. What are the numbers showing?
Not much has changed since the last federal election. So we're looking at basically 52-48, 2PP, two-party preferred to the Labor Party. Our MRP, which we published on Monday, predicts a minority to majority Labor government, next to zero chances of that occurring on the coalition side. So not much has changed, but again, it shouldn't surprise anyone because we are dealing with a country that is incredibly polarised now. And whenever the large major parties actually lose votes, they tend to not be losing them to each other. So it's either, if you're the Labor Party, you're losing them to independents, but sometimes to the Greens. The coalition, again, One Nation, UAP, independents. That's basically what's going on. That's a trend across the country.
But Tony, is it a little surprising that 2 years, all these interest rate rises, we had a referendum along the way as well, that after all of that, not much has really shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most significant thing in that MRP poll was the so-called double haters, which is an American term about people who've rejected both the Democrats and the Republicans and various candidates. And that's what we're seeing here in Australia, where that minor independent vote is over 30%, which the MRP showed. And I think the real takeaway, because there are limitations to the calculations, obviously, for some of these seats 12 months out, and it's not an aided vote proposition. The real takeout to me was the Libs aren't making ground in the Teal seats. They're not eating into the Teal territory. And if they can't do that, they can't get to 76 seats.
Do you think they're trying? Do you think they're trying to, or they're just not bothering really so far?
I think the opposition will be, their strategy will be, they can't outflank the Teals from the left. They would be thinking that if the economy is in chaos, the pitch would be a minority government equals economic chaos. So vote for a majority.
For stability, vote for us.
Yeah, and say to the Libs, come back home.
Yeah, and look, to both of you, if they're not making ground there in those Teal seats, they'd need to win back. Are they making ground in the suburban seats, this strategy of, trying to take on Labor in some of those outer metro seats?
It's based on what our analysis, it's minimal. Again, it's that national trend. So Labor's coming under pressure in Gilmore, in Robertson, in Lyons, which is in Tasmania, so regional electorates. And there seems to be holding its own in metropolitan electorates. So if you look at the coalition's national vote across all pollsters, it's in the mid-30s to slightly high 30s. That's the coalition's vote. What we need to be sensitive to is that the Liberal Party on its own is in the low 30s. And that's where it gets into trouble because that's where it's sitting in cities like Melbourne, Sydney and so on. That's where it needs its primary to be much, much higher to be in competition against Labor in some of those outer suburban elections.
And is Labor putting some pressure on Liberal health? I mean, you mentioned a few there that Labor might be vulnerable to the Liberals, but are the Liberals vulnerable to Labor in those remaining seats they've got in Melbourne?
Yeah, it's the international trend. So if you've got a university degree and you're professional, you're more likely to be voting for something on the left side of politics. And the transformation of our large cities, but particularly Melbourne and Sydney, when we're thinking about Melbourne's eastern suburbs, the biggest change there in the last 15 years is the number of people who have now got a university qualification has absolutely ballooned, coupled with an influx of the types of migrant communities that are not really good news for the Liberal Party. So yes, our MRP does suggest that seats like Deakin and Menzies are going to be pretty tight and they're going to be hotly contested. but incumbency does matter.
Let's talk about issues then, Tony. Cost of living, we know for the last 2 years has been number one, with inflation where it's at. It's come off a bit, still got a way to go. Is it still cost of living right up there, the number one issue?
Yep. It's number 1, 2 and 3. And what we're seeing, though, is this entrenched despondency, this sort of growing pessimism that it's not going to be a short-term thing, it's going to be a long-term thing. We released another poll this week where we asked respondents across Australia, 2,000 sample, do you think the standard of living will be better or worse for the next generation? Those who said worse were 45%, those who said much worse, 21%. So that is massive despondency, and I think it was a net minus 57%. And we also asked another question of those who are renting and living at home, do you think you'll ever be able to afford to buy a home? That was just 13%.
Wow. 13% of those who are renting or living at home reckon they'll be ever able to buy a house.
Yep, and 2 years ago it was about 42%.
Wow.
So, which was low, which we thought struck us as very low at the time, that less than half of the population who were aspiring to own a home.
So given that despondency, did anything in the budget a couple of weeks ago cut through, give hope, penetrate with voters, Cos?
No, it's business as usual. When we were, I think within that week, we were interviewing a number of Australians across the country, and the overwhelming response is, I didn't tune in, I'm not paying attention, I don't think our political leaders can fix this problem. So it's, complete disinterest out there. And that's a problem because the business as usual approach in Canberra has to change to get cut through now. And I think both major parties have to actually wake up to this reality that what they're doing right now is just not being absorbed by the public.
What about the budget reply, the major feature from Peter Dutton was going harder on cutting immigration, and we had a lot of debate about the various figures the opposition's been putting out there, but in broad terms, Tony, is that issue of whether migration needs to be cut and how far it should be cut, is that cutting through?
Yeah, it is, and that's been coming up for months and months now, this sense of infrastructure is being stretched, services are being stretched, whether it be GPs, bulk billing and so forth, and housing, and a sense of, there is an acute awareness of the high numbers of migration in the last 12 months. And when respondents come up with, exact figures, that's very rare in focus groups because they just simply don't usually absorb those sort of details. You certainly wouldn't know the unemployment rate, for example.
Much less the net overseas migration rate.
Yeah. So that sort of detail means it's personally relevant to them, so it has salience. So it is certainly, but it is only one piece of the pie. They're looking for hope, and they're not getting a lot of hope from any major party at the moment. So it certainly brought him some oxygen, which is always important, particularly in opposition. And
it's been a positive for him, to be clear. You think it's actually been a positive for Peter Dutton?
Yes, it has, but it's certainly not the silver bullet. I mean, there's a lot more work to be done, and he also has that nuclear reactor policy.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that. I'm interested in some thoughts on that, because just on the migration issue, does that play differently in different parts of the country?
Yeah, look, if you went out of Western Sydney, the response is, we need to slow it down because my roads are congested. So it's not necessarily around, I don't like what's going on with migration because it's putting pressure on housing. It's more, my roads are congested, which is a legacy of prior state governments out there in that state who have not kept up with pace with urban sprawl, so to speak. You come further in and it's different response, which is, it's impacting on my ability to find a rental property. It's perceived, because obviously there's some debate around whether international students, for example, actually do have an impact on the rental market in such a way, but that's the perception out there. But I wouldn't, as Tony touched on, I would not say that this is in any way, shape or form, the sort of galvanising issue that we saw, for example, Tampa play in the early 2000s.
It's not on that scale.
Not on that scale, absolutely not. Okay. People's perception out there in terms of what is going on, what is wrong with the economy, is a far more broad and complex perception.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about the other aspect of the immigration debate relating to immigration detainees being released and foreign criminals who should or shouldn't be deported? A lot of damaging headlines over the last week for the government and before that after the High Court ruling. Is any of that on the minds of voters?
It's probably indicative of a perception out there in the electorate that politicians really have not across their brief. And there was some recent news that a similar incident occurred when when Dutton was the then responsible minister. Now, voters out there, their response is, this is just part and parcel of what goes on. They're all blaming each other.
You're all hopeless, basically.
You're playing politics with this issue. You're not really focusing on the stuff that really matters to me and to my community. And that's, again, if you've got bandwidth to worry about those issues, then you're doing pretty well.
I mean, Tony,
it's 2024, not 2004.
Yeah,
and so sovereignty is still an important value for voters, but it's fallen off the charts quite a lot since then.
That's interesting. What about the broad prosecution that the coalition's trying to mount here, that Anthony Albanese isn't tough enough when it comes to keeping us safe? Using these issues to demonstrate that. Is that working?
To a limited extent. And it's certainly, it's an important issue, but it's just the cost of living is so pervasive that it's nothing else is just cutting through at the moment in terms of what's most important to voters. And intuitively, it makes sense. I mean, if you're struggling with rent or your rent is going up or your mortgage is really, really, crushing the family budget, then, these other sort of issues, as important as they are to some people, and I'm not diminishing it as a public policy issue, but it's just not on their radar. Whereas in 2004, for example, 2001, Tampa, the economy was great. There was no cost of living issues, almost full employment. And so these sort of issues of national sovereignty, were far more personally relevant to voters and was far more influential over the vote.
You mentioned... sorry, Cos.
Well, we have to factor in that we've also got a vastly different electoral roll, as in the composition of it. So baby boomers were absolutely dominant back then, and they now make up about 32% of the voters' roll. And that younger generation, which we'll probably talk about later on, just views immigration and international issues totally different to older generations.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about that generational shift. It's fascinating. Nuclear policy, though, you mentioned, Tony. How's that going down for the coalition?
Yeah, it's not great. We did some research in Gippsland for the Fin Review focus groups, and that is one of the sort of likely
potential sites,
sites because it was coal-fired powered. Look, what comes up in we've done about 20 sort of focus groups on energy in general. What comes up without fail is references to The Simpsons. Which is phenomenal when you think about it, a cultural icon. But the three-eyed fish comes up almost every single time.
Is that right? Because you hear this sometimes, but that's actually what people bring 100%. Up when you talk about nuclear power.
100%. Yeah, it's extraordinary. I thought the first three times was just an incredible coincidence, but our colleague Simon Welsh was having the same thing, and it comes up all the time. And look, you get some globalists, younger people, globalists, who've travelled overseas extensively through France, and they're in the focus groups. They're like, well, I've seen them, France uses them, doesn't seem to be any big deal. They're more open to the conversation. But even then, and this is where you have the quantitative stuff, which says that perceptions about nuclear energy is about 35 to 40% support in Australia. Focus groups give deeper meaning to those numbers because you can have a conversation about it. And what we do see is that 35, 40% evaporates. So in a focus group, which is in a quantitative exercise, you'll typically get 2 to 3 people randomly who support nuclear energy or who think it's something we should look at. But the minute you start talking about it and about being, nearby or in your electorate or in, nearby your town, it just completely evaporates.
And this is interesting. So it's more the concern really about safety than it is about cost when we talk about nuclear.
Yep. Safety and waste too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that respondents, always highlight with us when we talk to them about nuclear.
Which is no doubt why Labor's hammering them over the locations. Tell us the locations, more so than the cost of this option.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although they do, when you sort of prompt them with some more information and talk about how it can be built in 10 years, This is one issue where voters do not want you to rush infrastructure. They don't want you to take any chances with nuclear reactors. It's not like a road that needs resealing or something. So the safety is the big issue.
Well, is there any demographic difference? Because Peter Dutton often says younger people get it, that there's more support for nuclear amongst younger, perhaps those who didn't grow up with The Simpsons. Are you finding that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, as I said, globalists, people who travel overseas, younger people in particular, they see it over in Europe and in some places in America, and they're more sort of open to the conversation. But there is a gender split. Females are more against it, decidedly more against it, and they just reject it outright.
Interesting. Now, what about the Israel-Gaza war? This is in the news every week. It certainly is a polarising issue. We know there are very passionate views on both sides of this. How is it playing out, Cos, politically in Australia at the moment?
Well, politically right now, if we look at the one political party that probably hopes it's going to be the beneficiary of this issue, it's the Greens, and their primary vote's fairly static, whether it's our analysis or other pollsters. Not really moving all that much. And then you look at the MRP that we published on Monday, again, not much movement in the seats which you would think would be impacted by this issue.
The sort of Greens-Labor contest seats,
yeah, correct. Yeah, right. Seats like Wheels, McNamara and Melbourne in particular. So overall, I think this issue is important to those who obviously are very passionate about it. But the majority of Australians, including many who live in what we will define as progressive parts of this country, just don't view it as a top-line issue. They obviously have personal views and may be aggrieved about what's going on, but it is not motivating their vote.
Yeah, you talk to some Labor MPs and some of them are concerned about the potential for independent candidates, pro-Palestine independent candidates running against them. Should they be nervous?
The Labor Party absorbed a lot of backlash from the Muslim community at the last election. So I mean, we can see some of that attrition still occurring in our latest analysis. So the average primary within Labor's safe seats in Melbourne, for example, was 39, the coalition at 28, and the other vote at 31. Again, it doesn't translate to a loss of seats because we have to factor in that, as I mentioned before, many of these Australians moved away from Labor at the last election. We could see that in seats like Fowler. Big swings against Labor in Melbourne's outer western suburbs and northwestern suburbs, largely driven by the Muslim community in this country. And the reasons for that are complex, far and wide. So Gaza doesn't help the situation. But yeah, I would expect them to lose a bit more, but nothing the sort of size that we saw at the last election.
Yeah, and Tony, on the flip side, I mean, Peter Dutton has really lent in hard on this issue, very pro-Israel, very critical of Anthony Albanese for not doing more to stamp out anti-Semitism and so on. Is that working at a political level for him at all?
No, and again, it's not to diminish the importance of the issue, and I know that there are people who are deeply passionate about it, but it's just not cutting through in terms of the broader political landscape, because cost of living is just pervasive, as I keep on saying. It's just people just cannot focus beyond the monthly bills and keeping their heads above water.
So with an election less than 12 months away now, we know, Tony, is it really going to come down to cost of living? Who can present themselves as having the answers to this number one concern? Yeah,
I mean, probably 12 months out. May 24, 17 or 10 is the intuitive
I'm just writing those down. May 24, 17 or 10, okay.
And I think Albanese would dearly love to go later this year. I think he would dearly love to, because the market is talking about potential interest rate rises, which will be crushing for him.
He needs a rate cut, doesn't he?
Yeah, and even just status quo is not great for him, because every month the pressure builds and builds and builds. But there's realistically, as Anthony Green wrote about last week, there's realistically not a lot of dates. The redistribution final boundaries are in September and October. So it really only gives you about a month or two to campaign on those boundaries. It usually suits the incumbent, but it's untidy. There's G20 in mid-November, and all prime ministers think there's a mythical 2% bounce by going to G20 and being photographed with the president.
There never is.
There never is. And So I think, you're looking at May next year. There's no way he wants to go before the Queensland election, and probably not before the WA election.
Which is March next year.
March 8, yep.
Yeah.
So I think we're looking at 12 months, and the market doesn't expect interest rates and inflation after yesterday's figures to improve. And so I think, that's going to be, this election is all going to be about who's best to manage the economy and will make a difference to your household budget and housing affordability.
Yeah, and finally, Cos, that brings us to this demographic issue, because things like housing are clearly a far more acute problem for younger voters in particular. You've been focused a lot on this demographic tipping point as the baby boomers recede and the millennials rise. Where are we at in that tipping point? How is it going to influence this election?
Yeah, if you combine millennials and Gen Z, it's 45% of the voters roll right now. It's faster than I expected. So I think by next year, we're going to be closer to half the voters roll. And I combine them because they are very different as a group of us, voters. They 1 in 5 only vote for the LNP or the coalition. They have the lowest levels of party loyalty, full stop. So when we survey Australians around, which political party best aligns with your values, over half of them say none. They are experiencing the most severe of this, this most severe the impacts of this affordability crisis. They have the lowest levels of confidence with regards to entering the housing market, and they have the lowest levels of confidence in relation to the major parties having any solutions on the table.
So they're hurting, but they're up for grabs based on what you're saying, but they don't love the major parties.
No, that's right. So I expect if the economy worsens and these groups of Australians are the ones that will actually cop it, they will go to other parties. So we got a preview of that in the Tasmanian election, where the Liberal incumbent government lost a stack of primary votes, and it all went to the crossbench.
Yep.
It didn't go to That's right. Didn't go to the opposition. And if you look at the types of Tasmanians that actually went over from the Liberal Party, they were largely this group that we're talking about. And I expect more of this to happen in the mainland.
Which tells us hung parliament is, getting back to where we started this, a very real prospect.
Absolutely. And so the Albanese government, every decision it needs to make going forward is, does this particular policy announcement help us maintain majority or pushes into minority government? That's where we're at the moment.
Well, once again, terrific analysis from the two of you on how the political landscape looks at the moment. Cos, Tony, thanks so much. Look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
All right, now we are keen for your thoughts on this conversation. Any suggestions you might have for the podcast as well. Please rate, review, subscribe wherever you're listening to this, and send us an email, insiders@abc.net.au. Thanks to those who've already done so. We'll be back in your feed with another chat next week. In the meantime, look forward to seeing you Sunday morning for Insiders. Bye for now.